And I am going to very briefly introduce everyone on the panel before we start to talk about today's topic, which is well-being, community, and individuals. I'm Russ West-Pavlov from the University of Tübingen, one of the conveners of the project here and one of the conveners of the International Forum. And joining us today, we have a panel of South Africans, but in speaking to us from different places, not so far away from me in Berlin is Niq Mhlongo, who is by profession works in the publishing industry, an author, novelist, essayist, and is currently in Berlin at the moment as a visiting fellow and artist in residence with the DAAD, which is the organization that also sponsors our project. Also with us are three colleagues from the University of Pretoria, who to the best of my knowledge actually are in Pretoria. Molly Brown from the English department in Pretoria, a very close colleague of many years standing, and then from the area of psychology, but two different departments. Irma Eloff from Educational Society, so in the educational faculty, and then Tharina Guse from also from the psychology department, but counseling psychology. These colleagues are joining us today to talk about the tensions and the complementarities and the overlaps and complications between well-being in the global south seen from the point of view of individuals and communities. And we're going to talk through a number of issues around these two poles. Perhaps they're not as much polarized aspects as one might think, but from different points of view, we'll be talking around these issues today. I would like to pick up from a series of podcasts and statements and interventions that we all put into circulation before this panel. And I'd like to start with the interesting notions that Molly was circulating about the ways in which narratives tell us something about the ways in which individuals and communities, sometimes together, sometimes in opposition to each other, can generate and enhance forms of well-being, and especially the way that narratives from different places and from different parts of the world may stress different aspects of these questions. Molly, would you like to expand a little bit on the way that narratives from the South, and particularly narratives from South Africa, may have something different to contribute to these debates than those from elsewhere?
Sorry, having a little bit of trouble unmuting, but here I am. Thanks, Russ. I actually want to start with a little preamble. Like all academics, I have a devotion to definitions. And both well-being and narrative, I think, are very fuzzy terms. I think at the seminar yesterday, in fact, somebody said that there's a tendency to link well-being either to physical wellness or to material comfort. That's the point which our global culture is at. And stories actually have very little to do with either of those, at least obviously. And so there's often a sense of, why are we being talking about stories when we're in the middle of a COVID-19 storm? But for me, well-being has got a lot more to do with what my grandmother would have called peace of mind. And I think we've seen this very much during the pandemic, because while certainly conditions, particularly in the global south, where inequality is rampant, have made us all aware that the pandemic is a different experience for those of us with a house and a garden and a job and medical aid from what it is for those who are living in a shack without any kind of social security network. What has also been obvious is that even people who are materially comfortable are not experiencing well-being. There's an epidemic, apparently, of crazy dreaming around COVID-19. There's a general sense of panic and unease, particularly I find among my students. And I think this is where the concept of story matters, because how we feel depends very much on the stories that we are told and the stories that we tell ourselves. And you will have noticed that I have defied the almost compulsory academic background of a well-filled bookshelf, not because I don't have one, not because I'm talking from my kitchen where things are a little bit chaotic, though both of those are true, but I chose instead a Studio Ghibli background from a film based on a novel called The Borrowers. I did it because I wanted to make story visible. It's a sea that we all swim in and which we're often not alert to. In this case, it's a children's book, The Borrowers, about tiny people who live in the crevices of society, off of the leavings of a much wealthier society. They collect our paper clips, our scraps of cotton. So although this looks kind of cute and fairy tale and nothing to do with COVID, it's very much an image which relates to the people who live in the crevices of society, in the crannies, surviving off of what others discard. And I think myself that The Borrowers, if anyone's looking for something to read their children, is a very good story, because it in fact shows the resilience of such little people, their ability to create things, to make meaning, to be important regardless of their positioning. But to return to the story of the kinds of narratives that we get, and in some ways it's a little bit difficult. I think Kierkegaard said we have to live forwards, but we only understand each other backwards, or Swedish words to that effect. And so we're two categories of narrative. They're the narratives that we get formally through TV, through movies, through books, or in an oral culture, which are told by a storyteller or a parent. And most of these have a bit of a time lag attached to them. In some ways, those who produce them have to get beyond the pandemic in order to be able to think back on it. So I don't have too much about that, except to say that it's interesting. I know in South Africa, the publisher Kwela launched a short story competition in early June with a COVID theme. They thought they'd get 50 to 60 entries. They got something like 1,300. They're still wading through them. So there's clearly a lot of impulse towards making narrative. Secondly, there was a rash of things like 10 pandemic movies for watching in lockdown, or 10 plague books that you ought to read, a kind of looking backwards to other things. And that, I think, tended to be problematic, because literary cultures, as opposed to oral cultures, of course, in the global South, are newer. And so there was a turn back always to stories of bubonic plague or the buccaneering 17th century. And these, I think, have informed the kind of media awareness in quite worrying ways, because they tend to be individualistic hero stories. So the Bruce Willis or, Dwayne The Rock character faces the end of the world, but he goes out there punching, regardless of the fact that viruses can't be beaten that way. clears a path to his woman and possibly his children, because these days it's good to be not a bad dad, but a top pop. He finds somewhere, he gets a rifle, he sits on the porch, he fights off everybody coming to infect his family. He sets them alight if they're zombies, because this has also become a kind of COVID metaphor. And so the message we keep getting is the way to survive this is to take action and to look after yourself. And this is quite a destructive story when what the pandemic requires of us, in fact, is stasis, inaction. And those actions we do take are supposed to be the actions that think of others. There's opposition to wearing masks because people say they don't protect you. And it's true, they don't, but they protect other people. And if other people wear masks, those protect you. And this is, I think, a message that in the current kind of economic and social community, we tend not to question, but it's actually undermining in some ways what should be the rational response to what is going on. Similarly, the message of social isolation, retreating to your porch, not having contact with anybody, undermines human cooperation, human caring, the kind of things, connections that we need to make to emerge from this with peace of mind and with luck, without germs. Interestingly, there have been a number of books, many of them available free online for young children about the crisis. And here again, what is happening in South Africa, I can't speak for other areas of the global South, is that they're often based on American or British narratives. And they are highly technical and based on physical well-being. So they're multicolored, spiky little drawings of the coronavirus. I mean, we're all familiar with that one. Huh? It's got to be given a face. It has to be made visible in this way. And the message is, wash your hands, don't hug your friends, keep your distance. But I've been struck, I've been trying to look at the examples of this that come to me on social media. None of them talk about, how are you feeling? Is it scary? What can you do to feel better? Is there any way that you could maybe help others during this time by donating to a food bank or sorting through your toys? That social awareness in narratives is just gone. Then, of course, there are the stories that we don't formally identify as stories. And those are actually the slightly more dangerous ones. These are the things that people share on social media, that they tell to themselves, that they hear in other contexts. And here we get some very sad things. There's not only the COVID isolation story, but there's the conspiracy story. This is some individual's fault. And if you can find the right person to blame, you're going to be okay. And certainly in South Africa, what this lens has done is we've not only got the usual range of things involving the Clintons and Bill Gates, but it's intensified local suspicions of witchcraft. There's been an increase in violence around the issue of witchcraft. And it has also intensified xenophobia, the idea that the economic impact of the pandemic is being exacerbated by foreigners. So we've had strikes by lorry drivers, and our Minister of, can't remember which one it was now, security, I think, saying that they're going to bring in legislation to make it much more difficult to employ foreigners. So this is a particularly dangerous twist to story, I think, in my part of the global south anyway. We lastly are getting also stories that involve, we South Africans, race is our fallback position. COVID is a white person's disease that was brought in to infect Black people. If you are, it's only a white person's problem, so you don't have to protect yourself, or white people, like foreigners, are part of the problem. So sadly, because I do believe that in South African oral culture, I mean, Ubuntu is another word which is almost impossible to define, but it's clearly part of a long tradition in Southern Africa of human interaction. And I'm very sad that I don't see this surfacing yet very much in terms of how can we work together to deal with this? How can we support each other through this in either formal or informal narratives? And if anyone has ideas about how we can promote that kind of storytelling, I'm looking at you, Niq, I'd be glad to hear. Perhaps someone else should have a turn at this point.
Molly, thanks for that. I think there's some really interesting ideas there that about the way that stories influence our the way in which we understand ourselves in relation to others, or don't understand ourselves in relation to others, but only in opposition to others. But and I'd like to take up your prompt there, and throw the ball on to Niq, who's now you've done some very interesting work for this discussion in two ways. First of all, you're a writer, and so you're in the business of making stories and telling stories and putting stories into orbit. But you've also done some very interesting essayistic work recently on the sorts of community and especially family support networks that help people through different phases of their life, through education, through rough spots when maybe they don't have a job. And in particular, are we wondering, how does this impact on the sorts of vulnerabilities that are hitting people now during the COVID pandemic? And is that those stories about collective assistance and collective support, how do they play out in the current situation with well-being and an awful lot of ill-being?
First of all, let me just say thank you very much for inviting me to this exciting forum. And hi to South Africa, my panelists in South Africa, hello. But thank you again. I think for me, let me just start by saying that I think the seriousness of what is happening now, you know, because I've been here. Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know. Okay, what is okay? So I came here in February when the corona was still less actually in South Africa and also here. So in South Africa it was summer, meaning that the infection, whenever we had to look on infection, people looked through the eyes of the West and China and said, okay, what is happening in China? It's not happening with us. Only now with the change of seasons, South Africa is feeling it. But what struck me mostly is when I'm switched on the TV here and I realized that this thing of you know, wellness of the community is very much important in a sense that it's not only a South African thing. I've been listening to DW TV, watching DW TV, saying that, look, almost you know, Africans as a whole contribute almost 3 billion towards the GDP. I don't know how, I'm not an economist, but by that they were saying that the monies that Africans send home to Ghana, for instance, to South Africa, to Nigeria, and throughout Africa, amounts to that. Actually, it was new to me because I didn't look at it in that way, in a sense that, but it gave me an opportunity to rethink of what is happening as an African, the idea of a family, that there's a greatest connection between, you know, a middle-class family, African middle-class family, if you can call it like that, and also an African lower-class family. There's a connection everywhere. So we live as communal people. So as a person who is here in Europe, for instance, and then people think, they don't even think that I'm not working or whatever. They always have to ask money from me to look after them. Why? They don't realize that even here there was a lockdown to such an extent that people who work in the bus, people who are drivers, taxi drivers, or so on and so forth, were out of work. It means that they were out of work just like them in there, you know. But the impact of that, of how how people were affected, I think, it drew me back to the idea of what people have written about in the in black text. Why is that? Because we are living as a communal, the idea of family within an African setup, it's a communal thing, you know. So I'm Niq because I exist because that's why we have this thing of family clan. So I'm not only Mhlongo, I'm Njomane, and then which brings all the family members, including my uncles and whatever, you know. I have to trace through ancestors. So whenever there's something that I need to help and communicate with my ancestors, and which is more important for me to communicate with my ancestors for my well-being. It's not only physical well-being that it also has to be spiritual. I have to communicate with my ancestors. I have to communicate with them in a right way by doing all the traditional rites that are there. But under this pandemic, that is very much, it's not possible. It's not possible at all because, for instance, not so many, when we call a dignified, you know, family burial, for instance, it's no longer there because now it's no longer a community that is burying that particular individual who is supposed to be a communicator between us as the living with our ancestors who are dead. So if we don't give this person a right passage to join our ancestors, it means that the person might not be able to communicate our well-being and spiritually with our ancestors there, that side. So that's how the effect of this pandemic is doing. I would love to, for instance, have a certain kind of libation, for instance, pouring, making traditional beer, pouring a little bit on the grave, pouring snuff on the grave so that my ancestors can be happy, so that the person who has just died to be introduced perfectly with the ancestors. So at the moment, it's that thing that there's a disjoint, there's a sort of, I would say this pandemic has done a lot into, you know, the family, disrupting the family, the African family way of life, and also linking both the dead and the living, and which is very much important for us for our spiritual well-being. Because if we don't do that, we might not find jobs. That's what we believe in. If we don't do that, we might not be able to find a suitable person to marry. If we don't do that, we might not be able to be lucky, and then in other ways, or in many ways, actually, we might not be able to be lucky. So this is how, on a spiritual point of view, the pandemic has done a lot of harm. That's why people now are thinking of dying, are thinking. So the spiritual mode of South Africans now, it's in a low because of that. How am I going to bury somebody? So it's more like yeah, we're not in the right stage. I've seen that even through the communication that I have with family members, because by then it used to be when I came here, everything was, oh, in Europe, you know, this pandemic is happening. So they had to communicate a lot with me. So right now it's my turn to communicate with them because they can see me everywhere in Germany where it is slightly, the effect is slightly lower compared to back home, you know. So, so we no longer have, it has disrupted our ways of life. For instance, we're not used to isolation. We are used to, as I'm saying, we're communal people. We're not used to isolation. We're not used to, you know, being told what to do by the government. We're not used to too much government interferences when it comes to our well-being in a spiritual way, you know. But of course, financially, we have to rely on government. So at the moment, many people are no longer working. That's what I get from, so they're no longer able to be breadwinners, to be responsible people of what we call black tax, because black tax is about us supporting other family members around us, taking care of ourselves, and then making sure that the family tradition and the family values, you know, grow, because there's an interconnection there. You know, there's an interconnection of me supporting my family at home and making sure that the family line grows well. You know, we have to take care of each other. And also the fact that, you know, there's a social inequalities in South Africa. Many people are out of jobs at the moment because of the pandemic. So they are no longer able to do many, even little things that they were supposed to be doing as responsible fathers and mothers in the family, you know. So they're no longer able to do that. And it's becoming the fact that you can no longer even go to your neighbor because we are isolated. It's making us to be isolated. So it's a new way, it's bringing a new way of looking and living into an African family. So we have to look into an African family in a different way at the moment because of this, you know. I'll also end by saying that those disruptions are also happening in schools, for instance. I mean, universities, as you know, Professor Brown has said. Like, for instance, you might, if you're not aware, there are students actually that even now are diverting bursary money to support their families. But if that little money that used to come to them is to support their family instead of looking after them at a university environment. So it's some of them you'll find that they have to put their siblings through school using that money, for instance. So it is, I would say, the family, the impact of COVID has a lot in COVID-19 has done a serious blow to the foundations of an African family in many ways, in spiritually, financially, and also culturally.
Niq, thanks for that. Are there ways in which those family structures have been actually able to provide maybe alternative solutions or alternative structures in the midst of the pandemic, that or also ways of confronting it and you know, you've painted a pretty grim picture, and I'm wondering whether there's another side to a coin where actually those family structures are what help people to get through the pandemic in some maybe some unexpected ways.
Yeah, actually, what's more important at the moment is that I've seen that, you know, there is, because when we talk about the structures that are there, the structures of support, we're talking about the family, the community, and the structure of the government itself, you know. So that's the reason why in most, the narrative at the moment, looking into the township and also having, being in communication with people, is that actually it's, the good thing about it is that it's making people aware of the responsibilities that the government has towards its people, more especially given the situation of South Africa, the historical situation of South Africa, whereby there's a lot of economic inequalities. And those economic inequalities, in many people's eyes, including myself, for instance, were firstly engineered by the apartheid system. The apartheid system, how did it do that? I mean, it was through migrant labor system, where it allowed only a man to go and work, and also through by taking most of the land, which was more especially an African way of subsistence, you know. So meaning that as Niq as I am, I don't know, when I go to South Africa, I have to start from the scratch to build a family house, you know. So the government interference at the moment, it's making most people to realize that maybe it's in the right direction, so that the government try to redress what is in the past, or I mean the inequalities that has been the foundation of inequalities that has been laid in the past. The government has to redress it, and it's giving most of the people hope that maybe during this pandemic, for instance, we need more affirmative action at the moment for the government to interfere in spaces where families, families that are that have been under severe pressures of poverty, to benefit from them, you know. So I think that is the picture. That's the only hope that I see, that the government is without doubt being able to work more with the communities, because before that there were lots of people, there were lots of people that were opposed to government interfering or government helping out through affirmative action, for instance, because that's what is needed. That's what government is doing actually. So people were taking government's responsibilities. So people are hoping that, okay, maybe when I support my family, and then when I do a tax return, for instance, I'm still working at my family and I'm doing a tax return, for instance, then the government will take that into account and no longer charges me 25%, you know. It will charge me a little bit because I'm helping them out to look after a family that has been historically disadvantaged, and of which is the government's responsibility to address those inequalities of the past by enacting laws such as affirmative action, and then also land redistribution. So those are the things that I think when I'm talking to people and when I'm reading in people's mind, what they're saying is that maybe this pandemic came at the right time for our government to be unapologetic about doing such kind of redressing those kind of things. So, and also for us as individuals, not to feel burdened, you know, because many people think it's a burden for a family when I look after my family, instead of me it being a social family upliftment. So right at the moment, many people see it as a family upliftment because they can see how this a pandemic has ravaged their foundations. So because after it, if we don't do it, it means that our idea of family as Africans has to be redefined, for instance, and also our identities as Africans that are at stake here, because it seemed like we will be forced to live a life that we're not used to as Africans.
Thanks, Niq. You mentioned just before that the pandemic has made it very difficult for families to continue supporting siblings or relatives who are going through university. Can I, Irma, your research has been on the ways in which students can feel well or at ease in the university environment. And clearly some of that will also have to do with their the sort of support networks they have. Would you like to say a little bit about those, about that work on student well-being in South African universities at the current time?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Russ. In the current pandemic, one of the things that's come to the fore is that it has almost all countries. And the inequality that I'm most interested in at the moment is the well-being inequalities that we are seeing. So maybe I will just talk a little bit about the well-being study that we did with university students here at the University of Pretoria. We did that in the 2018-2019 period. And then to talk about those findings and the things that emerged for African students at a large urban university, and then perhaps to extrapolate from that for what this means for student well-being in the current global pandemic. So I talk about the details of that in the podcast. Thank you very much for mentioning that. But perhaps just to give a short summary, we were coming out of the Fees Must Fall movement in the 2015-2016 period, and the University of Pretoria were very concerned about the psychological well-being of its student population. So they launched a process of a 3-phased research study where we investigated student well-being. In the first phase, we conducted face-to-face interviews where we asked the students just one question, and that was to tell us about the factors that support their well-being at the university. And then in the second phase, we did some in-depth focus groups. And in the third phase, we looked at the well-being interventions that were present at the university. So perhaps just to share a little bit about the findings that emerged from phase 1, where we had the face-to-face interviews. We were able to talk to just over 2,500 students about their well-being, and it was students on all the university campuses from all the different faculties at the university. So we were very happy that the sample of about 2,500 students were very representative of the student population at Pretoria. And what was interesting here was that there were 2 major findings. There was, of course, with so many students, there were lots of interesting responses, but there were 2 major findings that emerged from phase 1 of the study. Of course, the first phase, the most dominant theme was that students referred to their environment, and the quality of the environment supports their well-being, which was for me very interesting, because a lot of the work in the well-being domain in psychology refers to almost like the social factors of supporting well-being, and very rarely do we look at the actual physical environment, the learning environment, and those attributes, and whether there's a connection between a psychological well-being and the physical environment. So students were telling us things like they love the beauty of the campuses, the gardens, the access to Wi-Fi that they have, the excellent lecture halls where they can spend time. They were referring to the library and the library services, the library hours, the access that they have to cheap food on campus. So a lot of things about the actual learning environment that the students in this study directly link to their well-being. So this prompted the idea that we should actually pay a lot more attention about the quality of the physical environment, which is something that we cannot take for granted in the African context, or in the South African context at least, because investing in that can serve a much more communal purpose and serve a lot of fun if we focus a lot of our efforts on providing a quality learning environment for them and not to take that as something that's for granted. So that was the first major finding. The second one, which was not as dominant, but what for me was very interesting, is that the students referred to the quality of the lecturers and specifically the preparedness levels of the lecturers, and that supports their well-being. Now, we've all seen at universities around the world, the student numbers have gone up quite significantly, which has put a lot of strain on university lecturers because they now need to deal with classrooms of hundreds of students rather than just small groups. So many times a lecturer would tell you that I'm not a psychologist, I'm a history professor, or I'm an engineer, and it's not my job to be taking care of the psychological well-being of my students. But what was interesting from these findings was that the students were not necessarily saying that it was the lecturer taking serving the role of a psychologist. These students were telling us that if a professor comes to class very passionate about their subject, very well prepared, and they do an excellent lecture, whatever their subject area or the discipline may be, the students were telling us that that aspect of lecturers were actually supporting their well-being. So two things there that can actually serve us well in the current situation that we find ourselves in. Because if students are telling us that the learning environment that they find themselves in support their well-being, and the quality of the preparedness and the passion of the lecturers for their subject field supports their well-being, what does this mean in a world where we've now gone online in most countries in the world, at most universities, and we will probably remain online for the foreseeable future? And even if we do get back to what we call the new normal, there will be elements of online learning that will be with us. So I think there's some interesting questions that we can be asking on what are the environments that we are creating online, so that it's not just content driven and learning driven, but that it's a caring environment that is inclusive and not just a transfer of knowledge model, but where we dedicate significant portions of what the learning environment online is to also be supporting the well-being of students. And then the same with the lecturers. You know, this idea that a well-prepared, passionate lecturer can serve a double purpose even without them knowing, of supporting the well-being of students. So that's just some of the things that's in my mind at the moment. We're very excited because we will be doing a follow-up study now going into the second semester of this year, where we will try to collect the data, but now in an online forum. And it would be very interesting to do a comparison between the findings that will emerge now in the next 6 months, to compare that with the previous data set. Students had access to the campus facilities, how they so that's from my side.
Thanks, Irma. That's very interesting. We lost some of what you were saying because there were transmission problems, but I think the gist of it came across. These are the technological things we're grappling with at the moment. You've spoken about the importance of the learning environment and how difficult it is in a situation where the only contact is digital, and an immense burden is placed upon a very, very narrow and restricted mode of communication between students and teachers. What I have in mind in this situation, you spoke about the learning environment, the physical environment. One of the things that really shocked me during the Fees Must Fall period was to see food collection bins on campuses in South Africa, because some students could no longer afford actually to buy enough food to get by on. And I'm also remembering at the moment that our colleague at WITS, Ruxana Osman, who's the DVC Teaching and Learning, and who was saying one of the major challenges they were dealing with was that 20% of the students didn't have an end device that would allow them to actually take part in the digital teaching. So we've got really quite elemental problems here that that it seems to me are even preventing the basics of well-being that that you're interested in looking at, like the learning environment. What happens when I can't even access that digital learning environment, and I'm totally cut off from the university? I mean, I think also of colleagues teaching at UNISA who said that there's simply a problem that many of their students in regional areas, in remote areas, don't even at the moment have proper postal contact, let alone online contact. So I'm wondering, how do we build well-being in these sort of environments when even the most basics are being called into question and are becoming fragile?
Yes, I hope my sound is a little bit better now. Yes, the fragility has quite significant. African context has been quite resourceful in negotiating support for students in terms of access to data. Well, universities access. Some universities have also been able to keep a small number of students who are at home, to keep them the predominant. They've done specific initiatives to targeted supports for the vulnerable students, but it is a significant challenge in the current pandemic.
Tharina, maybe we can move on to your your
so
area.
they're telling me I stopped my video.
Okay, so Irma has switched off her the screen, the camera.
They've advised that I stop my video and only keep my audio. Can you now hear me a little bit better?
Yes, it's a bit better. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, we hope that'll solve the problem.
Let's hope.
Tharina, you've worked on done a lot of work around well-being, which is in contrast to Irma's work on physical infrastructure and learning environments. Yours is almost at the other end of the spectrum, looking at emotions and affect and all the extremely subjective aspects of well-being, which doesn't necessarily mean that we're simply talking about individual emotions. It may be also a question of collective effect. And I think we were hearing a little bit about some of these things, Niq, in your comments. In what you said, Niq, I got a strong sense of suffering, not just about the material factors or the economic factors of as a result of COVID, but also a sense that what we are, by the way we are together, is being eroded, and that a sense of collective ill-being and unease coming out of that. Tharina, would you like to say a little bit about your work in this area and how it's being inflected by the current situation?
Yes, thank you, Russ. I hope I've been unmuted now. Yeah, I've unmuted.
You are.
Thank you. Yeah, in these challenging times. Yes, as Molly started with the definitions, I'm not going to go into depth with that, but I think coming from the field of psychology, for us it's very important if we speak about a construct, to say, but what is this construct and how do we define it? And much of my work over the last 15 years has been trying to understand the different definitions of well-being and then how it plays out in different contexts. And in addition to that, then examining the different individual factors and now lately communal factors that can influence well-being. So for me and my understanding, well-being is about, on the one hand, functioning well, and that is to have more positive than negative emotions relatively. And in the current context, it's absolutely relevant not to have an abundance of positive emotions because we're dealing with a stressful time. And it's also about being satisfied with your life to a large extent. And this is what we call subjective well-being, because only an individual can then make a subjective judgment about these factors, whether we have more positive emotions and we are satisfied with our lives. But we also know that well-being is much more than that. It's about other things. It's about meaning and purpose. It's about personal growth. And very importantly, it's about important interpersonal social relationships. Much research has focused on how we can enhance our well-being through doing specific things like keeping a gratitude journal, engaging in acts of kindness. And this is where the interface of individual and collective well-being starts to come in. We need positive and meaningful social interactions to sustain our well-being. For example, we need to share positive experiences with loved ones, and that increases our positive emotions. The same thing happens when we do something kind for somebody else, for example, volunteering or helping others in need. While these actions increase our well-being on an individual level, it has a ripple effect, because on collective level, it increases pro-social behavior. In other words, we start to support one another. And through that, we can actually start to support our well-being also in this difficult time that we are experiencing at the moment. But we need to consider also that well-being is the causes of well-being can be inside the individual. For example, we have certain personality traits or we have temperament, but we need sufficient material resources. We need a desirable society as well. And this is where, in our context, in South Africa specifically, the situation is compromised. I mean, we know that we have a very unequal society, which means that a large part of our population, the majority, does not have sufficient material resources. So they cannot possibly be satisfied with their lives as a whole. In other words, their cognitive judgment of well-being will be lower. And this has been the case before the COVID pandemic, and now I expect this to be even worse, because the whole pandemic has now opened the veil that was always there, but maybe we didn't always choose to look at, that there is such inequality that people cannot always experience high well-being, and we need to start looking at ways to address that. On another level, I also want to see, in the context of COVID, we had on an individual level had to leverage our existing strengths to maintain our well-being. We turned inward to our partners, to our children, as sources of hope, as sources of strength. And to that extent, I think the positive social interaction hopefully maintained or sustained some aspects of our well-being. But because of the limited social interaction, on the other hand, we couldn't really interact in society. We couldn't go out and meet with others and get that social support to enhance our well-being. And that obviously had a negative impact on well-being in a larger sense. We could do that if we look at connecting through social media or engaging in acts of kindness, donating food. But the issue is, in South Africa, many people could not access these means due to financial or physical constraints. So a small portion, possibly, of the population could do things like connecting with friends through WhatsApp, through Zoom, but the larger part of the society could not do that. Another thing that I just want to mention briefly in terms of understanding well-being is that most of our research is based on individualist, westernized notions. Contextual factors such as living in a cooperative society or having access to material resources are often considered only to the extent that it may impact on individuals' quality of life. The notions of how the complex interaction between individuals, social, environment, government influence well-being is under-researched in South Africa, and I guess in the global South in general. So we need to do much more research about what is subjective well-being in African contexts, and specifically who ask the questions, what vantage points drive this research. Have we really explored what accounts for well-being and a happy life in the African context? We need to ask more of these questions as we go along, and therefore I think we need to do a lot of qualitative research. Another thing that I'm thinking about is how do power and privilege, including the structural inequalities, influence how we study or how we interpret subjective well-being. We need to engage with power, the issues of power, to address these issues. But as I say that, we're only starting out. We need to ask these questions. And hopefully then we'll get closer to understanding it in a broader sense. But I would like to end on a more positive level. In my research on hope, including individual, collective well-being and hope, my research suggests that despite things going wrong in the public sphere, despite a pandemic possibly, we still draw upon the people close to us. We still draw upon our networks. We still draw upon our relationships with others, possibly also spiritual relationships. And this could be a supportive and a positive factor as we navigate a very uncertain period in our lives. And I hope through that I've contributed to this discussion.
Thanks, Tharina. I think there's a whole stack of interesting issues there that you've raised. You know, around the sort of the sorts of places that hope can come from or can be invested in, and the sorts of communities that support us. And perhaps this is the moment when we can open up the discussion for instance, I mean, I immediately think that, you know, the relationships with the ancestors that Niq has been talking about that are difficult to maintain if you can't take part in those rituals. That's also that's another relationship that is there, and that certainly a European influenced model of communal well-being simply wouldn't have on the radar screen, would it? No. So over to you to pick up some of these some of the issues that you've raised in your different perspectives on the situation.
Do you want me to respond to that, Russ?
Is anyone else?
Or I just want to make sure if it's open to the floor now. Okay.
Well, open to, first of all, to the six of you, and then we may have questions coming up on the screen from people who are taking part at the moment. So a free for all among the panelists is now opened.
The contributions are very great today from all of us, actually. I like the idea of I think whereby there's a mention of you know, the acts of kindness that always contribute to our wellness, our positive wellness. I just want to talk about actually around this month in South Africa, month of July. It's always an exciting month. It's a month that we all have this spirit of Ubuntu. You know, this 67 minutes of doing good for Mandela. People coming to the township, for instance, from all walks of life, from the suburbs, and you know, painting schools, trying to help build something for somebody, donating books to the library. So there's a spirit, it's a spirit that I think brought South Africans together, which is an act of kindness. So everyone has got this act of kindness. So I think we talking about it now with it's me talking from here as to that spirit. Actually, although it needs some physical doings on our part. For instance, it needs us to go and do something in a certain communities, because of COVID restrictions. It's unfortunate that most of these things might not happen, and these are the things that help to lift the morale of the country, even when we are in a rough ride like we are now, So those restrictions, I just wanted to bring in that point that I think is something that, the bad part of it, but I also like the idea of social media. Social media is doing a very greatest job in alleviating all these, depressions that are there caused by the COVID itself, because I'm able to talk to my family member face to face, wherever I am, to talk about their well-being, for them to inform me about what's happening at home, to help you. We can still do some of the things. So those are the positive things that we might do. But of course, there's load shedding, which means that some of even if you try to call, because load shedding also affects the networks and stuff. You might not, I'm not from my experience, that I cannot even access family members because of that. Actually, it's COVID-19 as well as load shedding. That is also, so the structural problems that we are facing in South Africa as well might hamper the good spirits that we, the well-being, our well-being actually, and the well-being of the community, because sometimes it's not, we understand it's from an African perspective that, this idea of us being together physically works, but social media helped us to compromise and also to learn the new ways of being together without necessarily being physical towards one another. So, but I just wanted to put that in, that there are a lot of factors that contribute to our well-being, and then also that hamper that what we're trying to do as to achieve it.
Can I maybe come in here and just add on that? Thank you very much for that, Niq. And I agree with you completely. And I'm so glad that you brought up the acts of kindness, because also now touching on Molly's reference to stories and narratives, is that maybe through sharing more of these narratives of kindness, because there's been a lot of kindness happening around us, small things like people maybe donating food, or people helping out in terms of taking care of somebody in the home. These are narratives of kindness that gives us hope that even though there's a storm out there, we are here for each other, and that gives us the resource to continue. But unfortunately, in the media, we've heard stories of fear. We've heard stories of, and of course there's a cause for fear, but if we only focus on that, we are going to deplete our resources to help us moving forwards. And if we can balance it with stories of hope, stories of kindness, stories of how we get through it together, I think we can contribute quite a lot to sustaining our well-being from my perspective.
I'm hoping that my sound will be a little bit better this time around. Well, speaking from education, I agree with Tharina on the stories of hope, because even though there's a lot of concerns about the impact of the pandemic in the education sector, there's also a lot of good stories coming through with the resourcefulness of teachers who were able to move their classes online within days around the world, and the excellent materials that are being developed as we speak by teachers around everywhere. And one of the ideas that's coming to the fore is maybe we can leverage the excellent learning materials that's currently being developed to address the inequalities, if we can create pathways for access to quality education for more children in the world. That's one of the comments that's in a positive sense from the education sector. Another thing is also that there are some, while we have concerns about the sense of isolation and the loss of peer-to-peer learning, that's important all the way from the earliest years of learning all the way to university, there's also some students who really thrive in the new environment, where they have more access to their parents, even if their parents are working. And there are instances where it's showing that some students are showing accelerated learning, where they are ahead of their curriculum because they can be learning at their own pace. So there's a lot of things that we should be thinking about that used to be traditional in how we structure learning, and where we can take the lessons from the current pandemic and make it more flexible and more adaptable and more inclusive for more learners in the world.
Is there a sense among us as university teachers that there are spin-offs, positive spin-offs with the current situation? My impression is that most of us are actually in a quite strange way suffering from the absence of our students. We tend to complain about them when they're there, but when they're not there, we miss them. And but perhaps there are also new for us as university teachers, there are also new formats emerging that we hadn't been able to engage with or experiment with before.
Yes, definitely. You know, the students of today are digital natives. They've grown up with access to technology much more than previous generations. Now, I acknowledge the inequities that we have in the world. But the digital literacy of the students of today is definitely an advantage. I was saying jokingly to someone else earlier today, with us moving online, I've had students who told me, Professor, just look in the bottom right-hand corner, then you press that button and then you will be doing this. So there's been a lot of role reversal of students teaching us. So there's more equity in the learning environments that I think is a very positive thing. We are learning from one another as we are dealing with this.
Niq, we can't hear you at the moment.
Go ahead from you. I just wanted to add on what Professor Eloff has said. Maybe what the other thing that the positive thing from author's point of view is that the pandemic, for instance, has given people more time to read, actually. So it has brought in, I think, brought in things that are very much important for our democracy and for our literacy. Like, for instance, whenever I engage with people at the moment, you'll see people posting books that they are reading because they have time to do so, you know. If you want to, it's easier at the moment to engage with people politically. So people are political conscious, economy, you know, they can talk around things of political and economic and social interest with one another. because they have time. More special people can follow things. They can follow what is happening in South Africa, even the policies. I'm just going back to the story of us having to, I think what we alluded to, the stories of fear, for instance, that Tharina alluded to. That at the moment, actually everyone, the debate in South Africa as we speak, amongst the people that I know who are on my Facebook feed, people are talking about the government. They're engaging the government. They're questioning the government with, I think there's something in Pretoria where the government is said to be digging 1.5 million graves in anticipation of death by COVID. And people are saying, are engaging the government in that, actually saying, actually, what kind of policy is this? You know, initially we wouldn't, people would just read something else, because now the news, it's in our faces. We need to know our well-being. Everyone is interested in their well-being. So we're cautious. We're cautious about who to talk to, the distance that I have to maintain when talking to somebody, the kind of books that I can read, and also the kind of feeds on my Facebook, for instance, that I can read, you know. So I'm just saying that maybe the positive things about this is that it's making people to be conscious of different things. And then maybe another important factor within the health well-being of individuals is the time itself, which we suddenly have, you know, which we suddenly have to read a lot, to participate in different things that are important for our well-being and also for our democracy, you know. Everyone knows that the American government, I mean, I'm just saying the American elections are coming out in November. People that I wouldn't have necessarily thought they knew. And they will tell you the important details about it, you know. So it's something that before people will never be interested in. So we have time. Maybe one of the positive things that we have to look into is the time that we have. But of course, time alone might not be enough for our the well-being of the individuals and society. But it's enough to make us participants in the democratic system, also in literature, and also to have a say in the running of our economy. So I would think that's a positive thing that has happened with this COVID, because there's nothing to do. You have to read and be abreast with what is happening around you. Yeah.
Hi, I apologize for the ringing in the background. We're completing an exam and there are various things going on in the background in my house, but there it is. I just wanted to pick up really on two things. The one is Niq's point about time and reading. And I mean, one of the things I think which has been important is that publishers have generally been very good about sharing their backlists, reducing prices, giving access to things. And I really hope that that's something that can be maintained. But Louis sparked me thinking, as did various comments about spirituality. You know, I may be spiritual, but I'm not a religious person. But it occurred to me that in fact, the ongoing kind of minimization of the spiritual in people's lives, which our materially based culture has been reinforcing, is perhaps being really shown up here, where we hit a crisis where there aren't particularly good material solutions. I mean, obviously one can help with food banks and their material things that people need, but what we need in order to survive emotionally is not only family bonds, but spiritual bonds of various kinds with the ancestors, with a sense of a greater being. These are all narratives which, as opposed to contemporary culture, tend to minimize the self a little, to look to the communal or to greater issues. And funnily enough, looking at Louis's comment, I began to think about this curious conjunction of Black Lives Matter with the COVID crisis. And I've wondered to what extent actually it's been that social isolation, that time to think about society, that time to consider one's place and the place of one's culture, hasn't actually fed into the Black Lives Matter rebellion. And, you know, one may regret some of the excesses of it, but fundamentally, it is exactly, Louis, a way of retelling stories about our ancestors, so that those who've been denigrated are being celebrated, those who were celebrated are being looked at in a different kind of way. And, you know, particularly one thinks of the taking the knee and so on. Is this possibly not indicative of a hunger for a spiritual, a focus beyond the self, which had been felt perhaps before the crisis, but is being intensified by the lens of the crisis? I don't know, this is all a little experimental, but I'd be interested to know what you think about it.
I can perhaps come in here. The study that I referred to, that you probably only heard fragments of, it was one of the smaller themes that students referred to their sense of spirituality in terms of supporting their well-being. So as a positive psychologist myself, I'm very happy with the increasing recognition that we are seeing in scientific research circles for the role of spirituality in its various forms for supporting our well-being. So I think it's an important point that you mentioned, Molly, and it also links to what you said right in the beginning about the difference between hedonic perceptions of well-being and the eudaimonic dimensions of well-being, which focuses more on meaning and living a meaningful life. I want to respond to, there's a question in the chat from Caitlin, who's a third-year student from Tübingen, and she's making very astute comments about the role of social media in the lives of students. Because I think she actually makes a very important point, that social media in and of itself is not necessarily just good or bad, but social media at the moment is playing a very significant role, because what we have with students is they're away from their peers. And I think even as we miss the students, I think students miss one another as well. And I think we've underestimated the importance of peer-to-peer learning, how much students learn from one another while they are at a residential university. And that's an important factor we should be compensating for. And in that instance, social media can be positive or negative. So I think it should be engaged with great caution. So thank you for raising that, Caitlin.
Are there any other questions?
Sorry, I think that the narrative of fear that Niq mentioned and that Tharina mentioned is being focused and intensified quite often by social media. And in some ways, this is also feeding into the narrative of inequality, because the message of social media and its focus on fear is accessible pretty much across the country. Even in rural communities, there'd be somebody with a cell phone. And what we're seeing, for instance, is that the return to school, which has begun in South Africa, is proceeding quite well in middle-class areas, and very few children from the really impoverished areas who need to be back at school, not only because they're not getting support intellectually at home for their studies, but because school is often the only place where they get a meal every day. And it's a narrative of fear, which I think is stopping that return, because the messages circulating on social media are not nuanced and aimed at getting a lot of responses and fairly strong emotional ones. Sorry, Russ, I think I interrupted you.
I was just going to ask whether there were more questions coming from the audience, and there are actually a couple that have just come up. And I'm going to, one of them is, I don't know whether you can see this, one is interested to you, addressed to you about the well-being of teachers. And in, well, there's a very, very long questions, which are a little bit difficult to paraphrase. Another one, the mismatch. Lilia is writing about the mismatch between European representations in African, in particular South African representations. And Lena Schlegel is writing about the well-being of nature. Yeah. Something that we seem to have left out of our discussion a little bit is about the broader environmental situation. In some ways, Niq, I wonder whether the ancestors aren't also a part of that jigsaw puzzle with the larger environmental, certainly coming from an Australian context. In the Australian Indigenous context, country is the ancestors, and the ancestors are the environment. But I'll open those questions up to those, to all of you.
I can come in on Amina's question as well as a little bit on Lilia's question. On Amina's question, whether we looked at teachers. In the study that I referred to, no, we didn't look at teachers. We only focused on university students, but there is a lot of work going on teacher well-being at the moment. And there's worldwide concern because teachers have been at this for months now without a break. Teachers reporting that they're working into the evenings, over weekends, as are university lecturers also. So there's some initiatives where school principals are giving days off, technology-free days, like declaring that Fridays is a no technology day, just to take care of teacher well-being, because the level of accessibility that teachers have to take care of the emotional well-being of the students are tremendous at the moment. So yes, a lot of work going on with that. And then Lilia's question around CNN. Yes, I know that moments of well-being. That's really wonderful stories. And I think it links up with Tharina's point on the kind of narratives that we send out there is very important. On the question of an overriding feeling of inadequacy and the negativity bias that we have, I think of the work of Barbara Fredrickson on positivity and on positive emotions and the asymmetry between negative emotions and positive emotions. For balance, we need 3 positive emotions to cancel out 1 negative emotion. And as human beings, we tend to pay more attention to the negative emotions and the feelings of inadequacy. The fortunate thing about that is with positive emotion, it need not be as intense, but it need to be frequent. It can be smaller positive emotions more frequently that can increase your well-being. So savoring this lovely cup of coffee now, or enjoying this 5-minute chat with a family member, or this WhatsApp call, Niq, to your family members in South Africa, to enjoy that moment of connection with your family can improve your well-being. I don't know, Lilia, if that answers your question a little bit.
I'd like to pick up the issue of the environment again, as moderator rather than as a participant in the panel, but I'm going to jump out of my role here. It seems to me that there's one of the issues that is slowly coming to the fore is the real connections between climate change and COVID, which up until at the beginning of the pandemic were really quite were played down and were hardly commented on. But there's a increasing amount of material is now circulating about deforestation and predation upon the various animal species that just happen to be immune carriers of various viruses, and a sense that actually the part of the response is actually not a response to merely to human well-being, but that the well-being of the environment, the rights of nature are equally at play here, and that if we don't begin to answer some of those questions, we aren't going to get very far. And it seems to me that there is perhaps some of the resources that we can draw upon are a sense of community that is not merely human, and that can be accessed when we move to narratives of the sacred, or narratives of spirituality, or narratives in particular in many parts of the global south, narratives of the land, narratives of country, that will enable us to start to, as we were saying before, looking beyond the self, but also beyond the merely human community, to a larger sense of where we are as part of a cosmic or a planetary polity that hasn't really had all that much attention, I think, in a lot of the commentary on the pandemic up until now. And I suspect that maybe this is something that can be that we, as part of this project, which brings together so many people from around the South. I found that it was very interesting that Amina was firing off questions from the top end of Africa to people at the bottom end of Africa. We have a Pan-African dialogue going on here at the moment, not to mention the other continents that are on board. But we have resources that really span the globe, that perhaps in this particular group we can mobilize to think about that the environment and those non-human actors in the planetary polity that sometimes get a bit of a short shrift.
If I can maybe just add on to what you said, Russ, I think what happened now with the pandemic is that it highlighted the importance of interconnectedness to our well-being. Like, everything is connected. I mean, the whole planet has been affected by this virus, from the non-human world to our emotional experience, to our physical health through the virus. And if we don't address all of these aspects in terms of our optimal well-being, it will not work, so to speak. So it made us aware, we became mindful of the very delicate balance of various aspects of our lives, non-human and human, psychological and physical, and that we need to keep that in mind if we want to move forward.
I've just seen that actually comments are coming from also from other participants. I have two panels open here that I can't keep up with. Anthony, thanks for that comment as well, and good to hear from you. And so these sort of issues are actually being debated as we speak, but by other participants in the audience. So I think there is actually an awareness of that is very heartening.
So I think the whole issue of the environment is I was going to say an elephant in the room, and I'm not thinking of a, illegally traded ivory either. And that is that, unfortunately, basic needs for anybody come first. In some ways, in order to be able to think beyond yourself, to be concerned about where your food comes from, for instance, how it's farmed. You have to be reasonably sure that you're going to have enough of something to eat. And what I find quite often in interactions in South Africa is that people say to me that ecological awareness is an indulgence, that the West has raped the environment for generations. They have generated material wealth and security out of it. And now they are wanting people who haven't achieved those levels of security to step back for the sake of the environment while not relinquishing their own advantages. So I think there's definitely something of a gulf here between the global South and the global North. And until the global North balances concern for the ecology with concern for basic living standards for people, I think that there's not going to really be a consensus. And COVID has really just intensified, as Niq has commented, people's awareness of the need to improve the material well-being of people. And it's likely to come at the cost to the environment. So it's a difficult situation.
Yes, I agree. And I think, Molly, with some of the things you've said now, links up to Lena's question and the Q&A, where she mentions the importance of well-being in the non-human world as well. We talk a lot about well-being of human beings, but it links up with the question of the environment. For me, there are three things that the pandemic has brought very much now into our awareness, and that is, as our external shrunk, have paid attention to our inner world. So we see lots of discussions about well-being and mental health and the inner dialogues of people, which for me as a psychologist, I'm very happy about. And then the second thing is we're doing a lot of rethink about the nature of education in all its formats. And then the third thing is the impact of human beings on the environment, and a lot of rethinking that's being done there. I know we all saw those pictures of the swans in Venice on the canals, and then there was a debate on whether it's fake pictures or not. But whether or not that it was fake news or not, we're much more aware of our footprint in the world and our impact on the environment. And for me, that's a very positive thing.
Can I pick up one more question that's just come from Salyu? Can you, about the connection between economic and spiritual well-being? Something the panelists might like to comment on?
Well, I'm not sure if anyone else want to go, but my first response is to look at the World Happiness Report. There's actually some very good work being done on an annual basis to look at the levels of economic
Irma, we're having difficulty hearing you again.
General well-being, which then well-being. So, sorry, I'll remain on this.
Yeah. Sorry, could you, Irma, could you repeat the comment because it got lost almost entirely?
Oh, okay. No, on the connection between well-being, economic well-being and spiritual well-being, I would recommend the World Happiness Report that comes out on an annual basis. And it links economic indicators at the country level and capital city level with well-being indicators at the personal level. So it makes for an interesting read to see how those factors are connected. I'll try and see if I can find the link, and then I'll post it in the box.
As moderator, I'm keeping an eye on the clock, and we are slowly, I think, heading towards the end of the session. Would people like to make, maybe each person like to make some sort of a summing up statement from their own point of view? We can go around the group, and you can round off and recap if necessary, as you see fit.
I suppose I just want to say that from my socially isolated household, it's been wonderful to have this space to talk and explore and get new impetus. So I'd like to thank everybody who's been listening and all my fellow panelists as well. And I suppose if I had to sum up what I've been trying to say is, I think and hope that one of the things that will emerge from our current state is that we will become more aware of the content of our stories, both the ones which are presented as stories and the ones which come to us through social media, through social expectations. Because until we start questioning those and perhaps consciously attempting to change the dominant narratives of our society, I suspect that all sorts of other problems, including economic equality, environmental degradation, etc., are going to be very much more difficult to solve. But that's because I'm a story alcoholic or storyholic. I believe stories at the root of absolutely everything.
Other closing statements from the panelists?
By thanking you and also my panelists, all of you, and the people who have participated actually by comments to this important debate. I think for me, what I've learned today actually also is that the question of well-being, you know, it's a broad kind of debate, and also it has to be looked carefully into by looking positive into the different societies. We have to understand, for instance, what an African family is and what it means when somebody says, I belong to an African family. If we have to look, if we have to, you know, if we have to contribute specifically to the well-being of the African family, for instance, we have to understand from this point of view what it means to be, the dynamics of the African family. Like, for instance, we have to include issues like you have to understand the importance of ancestors to us. Also, we have to, I think also well-being has to do with, to address the question of economic inequalities, more especially when you have to look into South Africa as a whole. I have seen what's happening here in Germany. I've been following through actually, you know, the kind of interventions that the government has been doing, and then which fits the German nation the Germans as a nation. But that is not something that as Africans we can simply import and then use in South Africa. because South Africa is is completely different. It's a different society from where we come from. I think here, I'm not sure whether I'm using the right word or not. It's kind of a little bit homogeneous kind of a nation, you know, whereby everyone understands each other, what it means to be German and whatever. In South Africa, there's when you have to understand in South Africa, you have to look into the question of, if I'm Zulu, for instance, my wellness is different from that one of a Xhosa person. You know, the way we communicate with our ancestors is completely different. And then, so while I'm seeing what mostly, I think, what South African government, the policymakers, the reason I mentioned is that the South African policymakers, in most cases, what they do is simply import what is happening in the country that they think is functioning and import it directly to South African society, which might not work. Like, for instance, the question of when we have to do with COVID, the way people had to do with COVID. Everything that was, they were looking into Europe. Oh, what is Europe doing? Oh, there's lockdown. Oh, there's closing of bars. Okay, there's closing of this and this. And immediately they took that and then transferred it to the South African economy, which is, in a sense, it doesn't work. It might not have a positive result, for instance, because our society is diverse and we have to understand what is it that we can take from other places and to import into our country. So I've learned a lot about that. And also what the debate has made me to be aware of, I think, is the last question of the relationship between environmental awareness, the environment and ancestors, you know. And then you mentioned the very greatest point of global warming. Is the topic that you won't actually hear many people talking about in South Africa. And I think it's more important that we start introducing awareness from an early age in schools, for instance. Learners should learn from an early age, you know, from primary school, what global warming is and how is it affecting them directly and their environment. People now are talking in South Africa about, oh, it's the coldest, you know, month, it's the coldest season that we have ever had, you know. They don't necessarily link it to the global warming, you know, because there's a shortage of such, you know, lessons. It's a lesson that I think we have to carry it. And I hope, that's my hope, that it should go into the school curriculum, you know, this important issue of global warming, so that we know that it affects me directly, my well-being directly, you know. It affects everybody around me. So it affects me to be living. It affects me, my life. So that's the things that I've learned. And also the importance of social media, for instance. I just love the fact that we today have been made to look at the other side of social media, so that to understand that social media is both good and bad, you know, and also the points that were mentioned. So yeah, I think it's necessary. This was most important for me. And also, yeah, it's very much important, and I think it's contributing positively to. It's a necessary debate that people should, you know, carry forward to help also in higher powers with legislations and whatever. You know, it should be something that we should be talked about every day. So thanks. Yeah.
From my side, perhaps just a minute. In my lifetime, I don't think we have had this much in common with one another for the entire globe. It's for me an extraordinary moment. So I want to thank you, Russ, and the team and everyone who's putting this together, this platform where we can learn from one another in this extraordinary history point in the history of the world. Thank you for that.
Just very briefly from my side as well. Thank you very much, Russell, and everybody else for joining on the panel, and for everybody who came into the whole seminar. It was a privilege for me to be part of this, and also on a broader platform than our usual psychology forums where we discuss well-being. One of my students recently did research on what hope is about for young Black adults. And the one thing that stood out was that they said hope is a light at the end of the tunnel. And I'm sort of thinking that well-being is about good and bad, light and dark. And I hope that we can use this period to look deep inside our own common humanity so that we can see that light at the end of the tunnel. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all of you for your closing statements. And I'd just like to pick up from the chat that's been going on the side of the screen. I think we should all go out and fly our kites, or paint some messages on stones when we go for a walk. It's these little aesthetic practices, in minor aesthetic practices in the everyday, I think, or tell each other some stories. But I hope that this panel has been a sort of a collection of stories and a collection of reflections for all of us, not just for the panelists who we've also been learning from each other, but also for the larger group. Thank you everyone for taking part as individuals and as a partly invisible, definitely virtual digital community. I invite you to keep on attending the different sessions in the International Forum stroke Summer School, and to keep on joining in this floating digital community that is that project with all its participants around the world. So thank you very much to everyone. It's been enjoyable, it's been informative, and I look forward to these conversations going on in other contexts. Take care and stay well, and I'm sure we'll be seeing many of you, or at least seeing many of you writing in the upcoming panels and roundtables over the next few days and the next few weeks. Okay, bye for now, and we'll be talking to you soon again.